Hello, my name's Rick Sheffer. I would like to share a bit of history on the Second American Gold Rush, black gold that is. I came to this subject somewhat honestly, I believe. For over a 100-year period, 4 generations of my family worked in the Pennsylvania oil industry, starting with my two grandfathers, my father, and me. This presentation is focused primarily on the first decade of the Pennsylvania oil industry, 1859 to 1869, but it also includes some of my family's petroleum industry involvement over the subsequent decades. So with that said, let's begin our journey into the early days of the Pennsylvania oil patch. The area of Pennsylvania dominated by the first decade of the discovery of oil was located along a creek, appropriately called Oil Creek, in northwestern Pennsylvania on a stretch of land approximately 27 miles long and 10 miles wide. This area in the mid-1800s was hilly, rural country, where industry consisted of farming, timbering, grist milling, and iron ore refining. Oil Creek is located in Venango County, approximately 90 miles by the crow flies north of Pittsburgh and about 40 miles south of Erie, Pennsylvania. The green area shows the Oil Creek area running between Titusville and Oil City, which is located along the Allegheny River. This was the black gold region of the early oil industry. At the very corner of the county is a little town called Emlenton, and this is where I grew up, as did my father and grandfathers, great-grandfathers, and even my great-great-grandfather, who came to this area in 1822 from Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. Within the next 40 years of the discovery of oil, the Pennsylvania oil field extended from the valley of Oil Creek and its tributaries up and down the Allegheny Valley for over 150 miles and covered over 2,000 square miles of land area. This map makes it look like you could drill anywhere and tap into this underground ocean of oil, but that was far from the case. A single vein of oil rock was limited in size, and the only way one determined where the oil rock began and ended was to keep drilling wells. If you struck oil, you were still an oil rock. If not, dry hole was the driller's lament. We live in a world today that would be incomprehensible without the byproducts of crude oil. Virtually everything we use on a daily basis, in some form or fashion, is dependent upon petroleum. Crude oil, as it is pumped from the ground, is a rather non-viscous, smelly substance. But from this raw material comes gaseous fuels, liquid fuels, lubricants, wax, sulfur, tar, asphalt, and petrochemical feedstocks. And from the feedstocks are made such things as plastics, synthetic fibers, pharmaceuticals, and fertilizer. But of course, it wasn't always like this. Before there was petroleum, power was generated by waterfalls or steam boilers, fired by wood or coal. Lighting for homes, businesses, and city streets was by candle power or expensive whale oil. But a little over 150 years ago, on August 28, 1859, all of this changed. For this was the day the modern petroleum industry was born. It all started in Titusville, Pennsylvania, by a man whose name was Edwin Drake, commonly referred to as Colonel Drake. This is the story about his discovery and the methods developed to extract large quantities of crude oil pumped from beneath the earth, as well as the industry that had to invent itself over the next several decades, for nothing like this had ever been done before. Of course, petroleum oil had been known for thousands of years, and in western Pennsylvania it seeped out of the rocks on the ground and floated on the surface of Oil Creek. Because of this, it was called rock oil. It had a bad smell and a horrible taste, yet it was collected by the Indians and used as a face paint and as medicine for their ailments. Public attention was first directed to the utilization of petroleum as an illuminator in 1849 by Samuel W. Kerr of Pittsburgh. Kerr drilled wells for the salt water he distilled into rock salt. The oil was a nuisance byproduct of the salt business, but in the mid-1850s, Kerr determined that by distilling the crude oil, he could make a pretty good lamp oil. And so he commenced converting small quantities of this minor byproduct into the illuminator he called kerosene. But this oil was just a diversion from his salt manufacturing business. In 1857, a man by the name of Bissell was visiting Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. While there, a professor showed him a bottle of crude petroleum oil, now referred to as crude oil, which had been collected on Oil Creek. Bissell became interested in the new mineral product, procured several barrels, and had the materials evaluated by a professor at Yale College. The report was very positive in its potential, and as a result attracted the attention of capitalists in the New Haven area. This led to the purchase of land along a stretch of Oil Creek and the incorporation of the Seneca Oil Company of New Haven. A year later, Edwin Drake, a conductor on the New Haven Railroad, was sent to investigate a way to extract the mineral in commercial quantities. After visiting Kerr's salt operation, he decided to drill for oil in a similar manner used by the salt well drillers. Kerr recommended an experienced driller by the name of Billy Smith and his two sons, and the four of them returned to Titusville to begin operations. They purchased a steam engine in Erie to power the drill operation and went about setting up their drilling rig. By the summer of 1859, drilling tools were all ready to be lowered into the pipe, and the rig started pounding the ground in search of oil. This process was slow, advancing only at the rate of 3 feet per day. On August 28, as the drill bit reached a depth of 69.5 feet, they broke through a rock formation and crude oil started rising slowly up the well. The oil was brought to the surface with a hand pitcher pump, and 20 barrels of oil was collected in a bathtub that day. The well consistently yielded around 20 barrels per day for the rest of the year, and sold for $20 a barrel, and yielding the company around $400 a day. But more importantly than the 20 barrels per day recovered, Drake proved that large quantities of oil could be brought up from the ground, and thus started the world's petroleum industry. The word of Drake's well spread fast, and from the east came men, money, and business experience who formed stock companies and leased land and parcels of thousands of acres and began preparing to put down wells. There was little existing mineral technology to draw upon, so drilling methods had to be improvised and invented. One method of drilling was the manual spring pull, commonly used to drill salt wells. The device consisted of a flexible pole placed over a fulcrum with a large end fastened to the ground. Drilling tools were connected near to the end of the pole and dropped into the driving pipe. Stirrups were connected to the pole, into which two men each placed a foot and pulled down, permitting the tool to drop into the rock below. When they loosened their hold, the spring of the pole pulled back up with enough force to raise the drilling tool a foot or two. Now this method appears very primitive, but sometimes it proved very effective and profitable. For example, one well, sunk with the spring pull, tapped a vein of oil which spouted 1,500 barrels a day and earned the owners $1.7 million over the next several years. Steam engines were used for power by those who could afford them, which greatly eased back burden and speeded up the drilling process. The first steam engines brought to the oil country were portable ones that ranged from 4 to 6 horsepower. The working elements of the drilling rig consisted of the derrick and the bull wheel, which was used to pull tools out of the well and to install the casing pipe. The Samson post acted as a fulcrum for the walking beam that actually hammered the hole in the ground. At the end of the rope that was connected to the walking beam was the sharpened iron tool bit, and of course the engine with the off-centered cam wheel rotated and worked the walking beam up and down. Drilling rigs sprang up along the oil creek like weeds on a deserted lot, and within the next several years hundreds of rigs were in search of this new mineral resource, and as a result wells started to come in. In September 1861, the Empire Well came in, representing the first great flowing well in the region. It started flowing at 3,000 barrels a day. Unable to secure barrels at any price, the owners tried to check the flow of oil, but without success. They quickly built a dam around the well and let it run into the enclosure, but the oil refused to be confined, and much of it ran off into Oil Creek. The yield bewildered the owners. It was just too much of a good thing. A few weeks later, the Empire was eclipsed by the Sherman Well that began flowing at 4,000 barrels a day, settling down to around 2,500 barrels a day for months. One of the best paying wells came in May of 1863. Oil suddenly burst forth, rising over 100 feet in the air. It flowed at the rate of 3,500 barrels a day, and for days the oil ran into Oil Creek, but finally it was brought under control. The income from this well varied from $12,000 to $45,000 per day, and altogether the well produced over 1.5 million barrels of oil and netted the owners over $5 million. Black gold fever was in the air. But with this outpouring of oil came technical problems to be solved, and industry infrastructure to be built. At the time, the only known use for the oil product was for lighting purposes, as a reasonable replacement for expensive whale oil. The potential market was global in nature, but it had to be developed. However, first, lumber in large quantities was needed for drilling rigs, shanties, and boomtowns as they sprang up in the oil patch. Supplies of all kinds were needed: steam engines, drilling bits, pipe, rope, and other equipment for the developing the oil fields. And of course, wood barrels for storage were critically needed. But there were not enough barrels in America to meet the demand. Whaling barrels, molasses barrels, and whiskey barrels were quickly added, and new ones made specifically for oil storage. Within a short time, cooperage shops cropped up throughout the oil region, struggling unsuccessfully to keep pace with demand, and the daily loss of oil was appalling. Some of the producers dug holes in the ground, cribbed them with timbers, and let the oil run into these enclosures. A young Iowa schoolteacher made his fortune by inventing a receptacle built of pine planks tightly caulked with oakum, and the result was the first wood oil tank. These tanks could hold between 200 and 1,200 barrels of oil, and before many months he was employing scores of men to meet the demand. But once you captured the oil, you had to transport it somewhere for it to be refined into kerosene or lamp oil. Transporting the oil first required filling barrels from bulk storage and hauling it away from the well. Wagon loads of oil were hauled over dirt roads that were not much better than logging trails. The Teamsters equipped with this service seemed to fall from the sky, as farms for 100 miles around gave up their boys, horses, and wagons to supply the need. There were times when $3 or even $4 a barrel were paid for these freelance Teamsters for the hauling of oil away from the well. The roads were made almost impassable by the great number of heavily freighted wagons traveling over them. From the big wells, a constant procession of teams ran back and forth, and it was not uncommon for a visitor to the region to meet oil caravans of 100 or more wagons long. Indispensable to the business, the Teamsters were paid very well, and they soon became the tyrants of the region, working and brawling as it suited them. Next, the oil needed to be refined into kerosene. Simple refining operations were built in the oil region near the wells and were not much more complicated than a moonshine still. The essential apparatus was a cast iron still, a copper worm, a tin-lined tank filled with water, and a collection barrel. The still was filled with crude oil and subjected to a high enough heat to vaporize the oil, condense it by cooling, and passing it into the collection tank. The number of refineries in the oil region increased rapidly, and by the end of 1860, 15 had been established, all of them of a small capacity. In 1862, a large refinery was built in Titusville at a cost of $250,000. Here, thousands of barrels of oil could be refined. By 1865, 61 refineries with capacities varying from 15 to 300 barrels a day dotted the oil region. Some of the great oil companies of the country grew out of these crude beginnings. Names like Quaker, Pennzoil, Kendall, Wolf's Head, Valvoline, Arco, Sunoco, and even Gulf Oil had their genesis in the Pennsylvania oil fields. The wells along Oil Creek had a transportation advantage. During high water, flatboats filled with barrels of crude oil or kerosene were pulled by teams of horses or mules and floated downstream to Oil City and the Allegheny River for a boat trip to refineries cropping up around Pittsburgh. A number of warehouses, oil yards, and steamboat landings soon occupied the riverfront in Oil City. Both passengers, machinery, and other supplies were brought up from Pittsburgh, and drums of oil returned back to Pittsburgh 132 miles downstream. In April 1860, the steamer Venango carried the first load of petroleum to Pittsburgh, and within 2 years there were 15 steamboats and towboats traveling between Oil City and Pittsburgh, each boat having a load capacity of around 800 barrels. The Allegheny River traffic grew to great proportions. Over 1,000 towboats and some 30 steamers were in the fleet, each averaging 3 trips a week, accompanied with over 4,000 boatmen, laborers, barrel makers, and tradesmen of all types, traveling back upstream to meet the insatiable demand of the oil business. Oil drillers generally believed that larger veins of oil existed at greater depths than the Drake's first well, and so wells were dug deeper. A number of flowing wells were struck along the creek in the third sand at a depth of 400 to 500 feet. Eventually, wells were drilled thousands of feet into the earth. The result was not only successful, but quickly proved disastrous to the price of oil. By May of 1861, 135 producing wells were in operation, yielding over 1,300 barrels a day, and the price fell to under $3 a barrel. In the earlier days of petroleum, oil veins had a tendency to become clogged with natural paraffin, which reduced production dramatically. In 1865, Colonel E.A. Roberts came up with an innovation that revolutionized oil recovery. This was called the Roberts torpedo. He conceived the idea of opening up the veins of oil-bearing rock by exploding a shell or torpedo into the bottom of the well, and an application for a patent was filed. The left side of this diagram shows a Roberts torpedo filled with gunpowder at the bottom of an oil well. The one to the right shows the torpedo after an iron weight had been dropped to explode the charge. The torpedo, on being exploded, blew out the paraffin, and at the same time opened fissures into the solid rock for the oil to flow. Nitroglycerine was later substituted for gunpowder. Shooting a successful well resulted in a gusher of water, oil, and gas blowing out of the hole and up to the drilling rig, as pictured to the right. Here you can see the Nitro Man arriving at the well with his wagon and tools. Next, he loads the torpedo with nitroglycerin, and then he steps back, quite a distance I add, and release the iron weight, detonating the charge and freeing up the trapped oil. But torpedoing an oil well was a hazardous business. Many shooters were killed either in hauling or handling the shot. Adam Culper of Titusville was one of the best-known well shooters in the region. He started out one morning in 1903 to deliver a shot to the Amos Klingler farm. While driving through East Titusville, something set off the nitroglycerin, and there was a terrific explosion. The wagon was blown to pieces. Culper was horribly mangled and killed, but his 2 horses escaped alive. My grandfather on my mother's side of the family was a Nitro Man who worked the oil fields in the early 1900s in both West Virginia and in Illinois. Fire was a constant danger in the oil region, not only at the wells, but also at refineries, in cities, and on oil pipelines. Firefighting equipment was scarce and generally ineffective against the extreme heat of an oil fire. Wildcatters were entrepreneurs of the day, and putting down a well in no way guaranteed an oil strike. The best bet was to locate your well in the neighborhood of a producing well, when one could be found, and then hope. However, the chance of striking a rich vein of oil was not in the wildcatter's favor. At the time, depending on its location, it cost between $3,000 to $8,000 to drill a well. In the first 10 years of the business, over 5,000 wells were drilled in the upper oil region, and over 4,000 were dry holes. Only 20% of the wells drilled proved productive, but those that did quickly produced wealth. In only rare cases did individuals incur the total expense of drilling a well. The usual way was to finance a well, was to form associations of any number of parties from a half a dozen to 50, each subscribing the amount of stock they elected. The expense of the venture was assessed pro rata, and the profits were divided in the same manner. This is a stock certificate for an oil drilling operation formed by my grandfather Myers. Several of these ventures were started by grandfather Myers, but none proved of commercial value. My aunt relayed to me that often critically short family money was invested by her father in the Myers wells, all to little avail. Housing for oil workers and their families consisted of board shanties built on the leases, and they remained until success made their stay permanent or failure caused them to remove to another location. The growth of towns and cities in the upper oil region was remarkable, with every class of business being established. The valley Oil Creek, from Titusville to Oil City, began to assume the appearance of an almost continuous town, comprised of shanties and oil derricks. In 1859, Titusville was a large village of several hundred people. Upon the completion of the Oil Creek Railroad in the fall of 1862, Titusville increased in commercial importance. Within a year, the population grew to over 10,000 and came to be widely known as the Queen City of the oil region. In that same year, Oil City consisted of just a general store, a grist mill, a hotel, and several other dwellings. But by 1865, it was a city with a population of over 8,000 and a major river shipment point for oil. It would eventually become the center of the Pennsylvania oil industry and host the corporate headquarters for such oil industry leaders as the Quaker State Oil Company, the Pennzoil Company. Note the names, Quaker State and Pennzoil. Pennsylvania was known as the Quaker State, and Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn, Pennzoil. Halfway between Titusville and Oil City emerged a town called Petroleum Centre. Farmland suddenly transformed into a lively town with 3,000 people, a bank, 2 churches, a theater, and a half-dozen hotels. It also included dry goods stores, livery stables, saloons, gambling houses, boarding houses, and scores of offices for brokers, shippers, and producers. With the influx of all sorts of people and an absence of government, the town soon eclipsed all others in terms of wickedness. On January 1865, the Fraser Well, located along Pithole Creek, began flowing at 250 barrels a day. A general stampede of oilmen to Pithole Creek followed. People came by the hundreds and thousands as other wells were successfully completed. Daily production grew to over 6,000 barrels per day, representing 2/3 of all the oil produced in the oil patch at that time. In May, the town of Pithole was laid out, and by September, the town had a population of over 15,000, comprised of 2 banks, 2 telegraph offices, a daily newspaper, a waterworks system, 2 churches, a theater, over 50 hotels, and the 3rd largest post office in Pennsylvania. Pithole was oildom's greatest boomtown, and a major oil industry innovation was spawned there, the oil pipeline. The unsatisfactory conditions of the roads, the exorbitant charges of the Teamsters, waste in the production of oil faster than could be hauled away from Pithole, influenced Samuel Van Sickle, an oil buyer, to lay a 2-inch pipeline from Pithole to Miller's Farm along the Oil Creek Railroad 5 miles away. This became the first pipeline transportation system in the world. Completed in 1865, the pipeline pumped about 80 barrels of oil an hour, and an oil revolution began in the business. The Teamsters saw its meaning first and turned out in a fury, tearing the pipe out of the ground so that the oil would be lost. Armed guards were stationed along the line, so the Teamsters burned their oil storage tanks, threatened workers, and generally terrorized the region. On April 1866, to protect the property and men of the pipelines, the governor of the state called in the militia, and the day of the Teamster was destined to be over. It is said that after the Drake Well, the pipeline was the most important event in the history of the oil region. The oil excitement attracted all sorts of people with a variety of skill and temperament. John Wilkes Booth performed in Franklin, a town just downriver from Oil City, and visited other towns and cities in the region. In fact, he owned a 13th interest in the Homestead Well, for which he paid $15,000, but he sold out in 1864 and within a short time left the region for Washington, D.C., and a date with the infamy. Ironically, 6 weeks after the assassination of Lincoln, the Homestead Well struck oil. Another man of notoriety was Ben Hogan, a man of extreme promotional talent. He arrived at Pithole in 1865 and opened a palatial sporting house, the receipts from which often totaled over $1,000 a day. Hogan followed the tide of oil development and opened a total of 7 free and easies in oil patch communities as new strikes were made. He was the most notorious character in the oil region. Associates Lizzie Toplin and French Kate were well-known professionals in his business enterprise. The rise of Pithole was swift and amazing, but its decline was even more breathtaking. Within 2 years, some of the big wells stopped flowing, and an increasing number of dry holes were drilled. Production fell off sharply. Operators, speculators, businessmen, and others quickly departed, and by January 1867, Pithole was a deserted city. A series of disastrous fires razed most of the buildings. Others were torn down and moved to other new oil towns. Railroads soon pressed river traffic as the primary means of oil transportation out of the region. At the time of the discovery of oil, there were only 3 rail lines running through the northern Pennsylvania and southern New York area. By 1867, railroad lines reached all major transport areas within the region, and out to markets south along the Allegheny River to Pittsburgh, and east to New York, and west to Chicago. The oil region now had pipelines and miles of freight service clear to the seaboard. At first, barrels of oil were loaded on flat cars. Next came the introduction of the tank car that was devised during the summer of 1865. Here, 2 wooden tanks were mounted on a flat car. Each tank contained 40 to 50 barrels of oil, and by the spring of 1866, hundreds of them were in use. This type of oil tank car prevailed until the iron tank car first appeared in 1869. The tank was made of boiler steel and reached the full length of the flat car. This was the last and best railroad shipping improvement for oil. But still, a man with a 1,000-barrel well in his hands was in a jam. He had to sell his oil at once for lack of storage room, or let it run out on the ground. And in the early days, there was no oil exchange, no market, telegraph, or even a post office within reach where he could arrange a sale. He had to rely on a buyer to come to him. These buyers were the agents of the refineries in different cities, or of the exporters of crude in New York. These buyers went from well to well on horseback, and at each producing well made special bargains, each varying with the quantity bought and the difficulty in getting it hauled away. When the railroads came in, the trains became the headquarters for both buyers and sellers. This made it more easily managed that the trains on the creek stopped at almost every oil farm. These trains became a sort of traveling oil exchange, and on them a large percentage of all the bargaining of the business was done. The brokers and buyers first organized and established headquarters in Oil City in 1869, and Titusville organized an exchange in 1871. However, the New York City Oil Exchange preceded them and was shipping oil and kerosene around the globe by 1866. By 1872, the Pennsylvania oil field produced nearly 6 million barrels of oil a year and had raised this product to the 4th place among the exports of the United States, with over 152 million gallons going abroad in 1874. The market had grown to virtually every country in the world. By the early 1870s, capitalists were well entrenched in the oil industry. W. H. Abbott, Jay Gould, and Henry Fisk owned major railroad lines, pipelines, and an oil refinery near Jersey City. Throughout the 1960s, John D. Rockefeller went from buying up refinery facilities at a storm's pace, as well as negotiating highly preferential freight rates for shipping oil to and from his refineries. The name of the firm was, of course, the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, and it grew to control over 70% of all the refining facilities in the United States. In 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States found Standard Oil guilty of monopolizing the petroleum industry, and the Standard Oil Company was broken up into several competing firms. During the first decade of the oil industry, Venango County dominated the field, and by 1862 produced over 3 million barrels of oil, and by 1870 annual production ran to over 5.4 million barrels. The number of producing oil wells in Venango County peaked at just over 4,000 wells in 1880. And total yearly production peaked 2 years later at 31 million barrels, with oil prices at close to their all-time low of 80 cents a barrel. Over the next 20 years, the Pennsylvania oil region expanded north into Warren and McKean counties, and south down the Allegheny Valley through Clarion, Butler, and Allegheny counties. And in 1870, when oil wells began flowing in Clarion County, which was just adjacent to Venango County, my great-grandfather joined the oil field as a mechanic and oil field worker. His early duties encompassed repairing machinery and standing tower watch at the well site. Here you can see two individuals, one relaxing on a chair in front of his rig and the other sitting on a stand, both individuals standing tower watch. These individuals stood 12-hour watch periods and were responsible for the drilling operations of their wells. And if and when they struck oil, their job was to marshal the men and equipment to cap the well and bring it in. Pictured is G.M. Sheffer and his 1872 Tower Watch log, which he recorded his daily activities. The following is representative of his Tower Watch log entries. February 19, 1872. This day I did not work on any account of the engine being broke down. This afternoon went to John Cotterman's and back to Gas City. February 20th. This day I did not work on any account of the engine being broke down. February 21. This afternoon we started up canning well number 7. Again, the drilling today was very good this day. We went through the first streak of red rock at about the first sand. February 22nd. This day I went on tower at 1 o'clock. The drilling today was very hard above the first sand. By 1875, the oil boom was in full force in Clarion County, and G.M. Sheffer started his first blacksmithing and tool repair shop in a boomtown called Pickwick. Situated along the new Emlenton-Shippenville Railroad and located at the center of the county's oil industry, the town seemed perfect for his operation. He called his company the Dutch Machine Works, and here he serviced the needs of the oil fields for the next 7 years. Pictured here is Mr. and Mrs. G.M. Sheffer and their young family and shop workers. Here is an 1880 advertisement for the Dutch Machine Works, which offered the following services: general repairing done on short notice, second-hand engines for sale, working barrels, orders by mail or telegraph solicited. Pickwick, Clarion County, PA, 1880. Over the next 20 years, as oil well production diminished in one area or another, GM moved his machine shop operation 2 more times as he followed the prevailing oil strikes in the region. Rapid strides were being made in tools, rigs, and in all the various essentials of well drilling. When tools were lost down a well, they found better ways to recover them, and my great-grandfather put his ingenuity to work to help solve some of these drillers' problems. In 1876, GM was granted a patent for a device used to fish broken drill bits and sucker rods out of a well. The device would latch on to and secure the tools so they could be raised out of the well and be re-welded like new. Here is a blurb in a local newspaper regarding this device. Daily Herald, Edinburgh, Clarion County, PA, Tuesday morning, August 7th, 1877. G.M. Sheffer of Pickwick is now ready to draw casing with his new patented casing spear. All orders promptly filled. In all, G.M. Sheffer was awarded 5 U.S. patents over the course of his business career, ranging from drilling tools to railroad equipment to a steam engine improvement that he called the Daisy engine. In 1882, the Sheffers moved to Emlenton and set up the Sheffer Machine Shop there, providing the same services to the oil industry. Here is a picture of the first Emlenton shop with GM standing proudly in front. By 1890, the oil field around Emlenton was in serious decline, and the oil business for the Sheffer Machine Shop dramatically slowed. However, word spread of an oil strike that came in south of Pittsburgh at a town called McDonald. In order to support the family, the decision was made that GM and their oldest son, Austin, my grandfather, who was 12 at the time, would leave home and start up a shop in McDonald, PA. They called their new company the Daisy Machine Shop, GM Sheffer proprietor, and like before, they sharpened and straightened drilling bits and made fishing tools for the oil patch. They batched it, as it was called at the time, and only returned home to Emlenton for major holidays. Pictured here is GM on the right, Charlie, their helper, on the left, and my grandfather in the center at their operation in McDonald, Pennsylvania. In a letter Austin wrote home to his mother in 1892, he said that after a full day of work, he went to school. I am going to school at night. Charlie goes too. We pay $1 a month. We have arithmetic, writing, reading, and sometimes we have geography. It starts at 7 and lets out at 9. It's in the public school. For 2 years they worked in McDonald, and when the oil field dried up, they returned to their home and family in Emlenton. GM rewarded my grandfather for his work in McDonald with a brand new bicycle, the very first bicycle to run the dirt streets of Emlenton. Around the turn of the century, GM tore down the old wood shop and built a new shop made of steel, trusses, and cement block. Here you see my grandfather working at building the new machine shop. The new machine shop was completed and promoted as the GM Sheffer Machine Works and Garage, gas and gasoline engines. Here my grandfather poses before the new building. The picture lower left shows my grandfather and his younger brother sitting on a drill bit ready to be straightened. Here is an inside view of the line shaft, powered by a steam engine that ran the lathe, drill presses, and forging hammer. My Aunt Aline told me that at one time the boiler blew up and landed on the house across the street. Fortunately, no one was hurt. By the early 1920s, the machine shop business was so limited that it couldn't adequately support Granddad's growing family. So he went to work as a machinist at the Quaker State Refinery in Emlenton, retiring in 1945. My father, George Elmer Sheffer, graduated from Penn State College as a mechanical engineer in 1936 and worked here at the Quaker State Refinery his entire career, except for 2 years when he worked at the Quaker State Refinery in St. Mary's, West Virginia. There he met and married my mother. While I was in college, I worked at this refinery, cleaning and painting oil tanks for a summer job. Quaker State closed the refinery in the mid-1970s and moved its corporate headquarters from Oil City to Houston, Texas. Pennsylvania's role in the petroleum industry dominated until 1901, when a Pennsylvania oilman drilled a well in southwest Texas that gushered forth a wealth of Texas crude oil. The well was called Spindle, and the Texas, Oklahoma, and California oil fields became America's new oil patch, and Pennsylvania was never quite the same since. In 1859, the global oil industry produced just 2,000 barrels of crude oil, and was contained to a 27-mile stretch of land along a stream in Venango County, Pennsylvania, called Oil Creek. In 2007, the United States alone produced 8.4 million barrels of crude every day. Today, the world crude oil production for the top 20 producing countries exceeds 70 million barrels a day. The mineral petroleum is now the lifeblood of the global economy, but the future supply of oil is somewhat in question. Throughout 2009, the Pennsylvania oil region celebrated its 150th year anniversary. Communities were asked to host 1 week of the celebration with presentations and exhibits. That September, Emlenton hosted a regional celebration, and I was asked to be the primary presenter for the town. The oil museum in Emlenton is called the Pumping Jack Museum, and they were my hosts for the event. The reason the museum asked me to be the primary presenter was due to an incredible photo and archive collection my Aunt Hazel accumulated over many years as a resident of the town. Having an interest in history, I inherited her collection. I also repatriated to the town copies of all the old town photographs, numbering some 600 or more, as well as some of the other area memorabilia of my Aunt Hazel's. My talk at the museum chronicled my family's journey in 1773 from Germany to America, and their migration from Philadelphia to Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, and then north in 1922 to Venango and Clarion counties, and finally their involvement in what was referred to as the lower oil region of Pennsylvania. Here is a view in the Pumping Jack Museum with wall exhibits depicting the town's involvement in the oil industry. It is now housed in the old community schoolhouse where I went to school. This schoolhouse that houses the Pumping Jack Museum was built totally by the generosity of Emlenton resident H.J. Crawford, who was founder and a major stockholder in the Emlenton Refining Corporation. In 1931, 19 distinct companies, including the Emlenton Refining Corporation, were consolidated and merged into the new Quaker State Oil Refining Corporation. And Mr. Crawford, at the age of 64, was elected president and CEO of the new corporation and served until his death in 1953. Today, with the discovery of the Marcellus Shale Basin, located in parts of New York, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia and Ohio, massive volume of natural gas reserves are now available for recovery through deep drilling and a technology called fracking. And most experts agree that we currently have more natural gas than Saudi Arabia has oil. In fact, the United States recently passed Russia to become the world's largest producer of natural gas. Black gold, oil, the second American gold rush. Perhaps natural gas will be Pennsylvania's second gold rush. Thank you very much for your kind attention to my presentation today.